So you want to get your architecture and real estate photos turned around as quickly as possible, but still looking amazing. This is the video for you. This is the one thing that I've been asked the most without doubt, and it's how to create a preset that we can apply to any image and get it looking good regardless of what its starting point is, so we can get it back to our client really quickly and save ourselves some time. So that's what I'm going to go through in Lightroom in this video. So just to give you an indication of what we're working towards here, in front of me you can see the raw unedited file, and as I release you're going to see that preset applied. As I jump over to another image which is straight out of camera, extremely high contrast like you wouldn't imagine, and as I release, that preset has taken care of that for us. So let's get into how we actually construct this preset. So I'm just going to reset these images and we're just going to pick one at random that we can work on. And although you don't see it here, we are currently in the develop module. I've just closed that down and I'm going to right click here and switch to solo mode, so that way we're only seeing one tool at a time and we can focus on that. And we're just going to work sequentially through this. We're going to start at the top, finish at the bottom. So the first thing we want to do is address the color profile. As you guys know, I like to work with a flat camera profile because that's just going to unlock a greater dynamic range than working with a more vivid profile. So even if we go to something that's camera matching, and we went to say the vivid camera profile that is designed for my Nikon D800. However, as you see, when I move from that over to the flat version here, it's less contrasty, but I've had a lot more dynamic range unlocked for me, and that is exactly what we want to start with. Because one of the main things that we're trying to overcome with this preset is what we're often faced with when we shoot interiors, and that is an extreme contrast difference between what's going on, that brightness outside the window, and the darker interior. But we want to create a more harmonized image, and the way we do that is by first of all condensing that dynamic range into something that is visible to us on the screen, and then once we've recovered that information in the highlights and the shadows, then we can start building back in contrast. But it's going to all be done through this preset. Because if I go back to grid mode very quickly and we look at these raw images, if I just click on any one of these, you can see the extreme difference between the interior and the exterior. That difference between how bright it is outside and how dark it is inside is clear for everyone to see, and it's also right there in the histogram as well. And it's that differential that we're trying to take care of. So we'll jump back to this image for now. I'll press D on the keyboard to jump back to the develop module and carry on working. Now the next issue that we may be faced with is the white balance, and of course, as you know, we can set our own white balance. We can do that manually as well. However, for the preset, what we're going to have to do is just rely solely on what the camera thought was correct at time of capture, because we don't want to hard bake in an absolute value into this white balance, because what may work for one image isn't going to work for another. And so that's why we're going to just trust the camera on this instance. I recommend shooting a bracketed set of images so you actually have different exposure values captured by the camera, and therefore we're not going to change the exposure value here because again we don't want to bake in an absolute value for that. We're just going to use the image that has the best exposure in the first place. Now I said I was going to work sequentially, but just bear with me because I'm going to revisit contrast, because what I would like to do first of all is just pull the highlight slider down all the way to -100, and as you will have seen outside of the window there, all of a sudden we recovered all of that data in the sky. So that's much better. Now you can see we have a lot of shadow area through the middle of the kitchen here, so I'm just going to grab the shadow slider and boost that up. By bringing down the white point and also boosting up the black point, we've recovered a whole heap of that data that existed in the original raw file. However, we're getting a very HDR look, like not a particularly good one. So what we want to do is actually create a balance between recovering all of that information but also having our image look very flat. We want to be able to see all of the information in the highlights and the shadows as well, but we don't want to lose contrast like we did initially. And so like I say, it's a bit of a balancing act. So what I like to do is bring the contrast up, so we are reintroducing that contrast. And if you look at the histogram here, you can actually see that we've condensed the dynamic range to a point that we no longer have a pure white point. And so what I like to do is just start bringing that back up. And for me, somewhere around that 0 mark is actually pretty good. And with the black point, I normally bring that down just a little bit away from that very far end. We don't want it all the way at +100. Something around +70 works well for my camera. So if I use the / key to show you the before image of this, this is our raw photo. and then I release, you can see that already we've made a significant change to this photo, but we've still got a long way to go. Okay, next we're going to deal with the present section, and in particular we're going to look at texture, we're going to look at clarity, and we're going to look at dehaze as well. By all means, have a play around with these sliders and see what looks good for your camera. What I'm after is adding a bit of punch to my photo, but without it looking too fake. If I push the texture all the way up to 100, I'm not a big fan of this look, however, a little can help us. So let's set that somewhere around that +9 mark. But of these three sliders, I do feel that clarity is the one that we can get away with putting more in. I'm at 100% here, that is too much. However, somewhere around that sort of 25 to 30 range, I normally find that's pretty good. Because by its very nature, architectural photography is a lot more forgiving of more aggressive clarity shifts than other types of photography. And of these three sliders, the dehaze slider is probably my least favorite and least useful for this type of photography because of the color shifts that get introduced as you actually start boosting that up. But you may find that just a little bit of this dehaze slider is actually beneficial just to give your photo a little bit of a boost. I'm going to leave that at +4. These are the settings that I like, but I recommend you just have a play around with these and season to taste your own photos. As I flick back to our original and release, if you look in the white areas of the photo here, you can see that it starts to get a yellow cast going on as we've made these adjustments, and that is just the nature of adding more contrast to our photo. The saturation of the whole image is going to get increased, and so we're going to actually deal to that in a couple of ways. We're going to look at both the vibrance and saturation sliders here, but we're also going to work in conjunction with the color section here as well. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually boost up the vibrance. I don't want to increase the saturation too much. I prefer using the vibrance slider because, as you know, that is a biased slider, so it's going to introduce saturation more to colors that are already saturated rather than a global saturation. So the vibrance slider is my preference. I'm just going to push a little bit of vibrance in. I know that's adding more saturation, and I was saying that overall we want to reduce that saturation. But the thing I notice most with interior photography is usually if there's any kind of cast going on, it will be a yellowy or orange kind of cast. And so we can actually use the yellow and orange hue sliders to actually decrease the saturation of the orange. We can do the same with the yellows as well. We can desaturate that slider. We don't want to take things too far. Yes, absolutely, that's neutralized the whites of the walls beautifully. However, we don't want to kill our color completely. So in this instance, I'm going to go -40 on the yellow, maybe -30 on the orange. And the other thing we can do is look at the blues as well. Now, if we look outside, oftentimes the blue from the outside can start to contaminate the interiors. So of course, if we reduce the saturation of the exterior blue, we're going to take that away from the interior, which potentially could be a really good thing. However, for a one-size-fits-all preset, what I prefer to do is actually just boost the saturation, maybe just a little bit, and actually reduce the luminance. And if I go really heavy-handed with this so that you can see what's going on, of course that is bringing back our sky outside of the window. That's far too heavy-handed. We don't want to be doing that. And obviously, as we reduce the luminance, the saturation level goes up. So we don't want to go too heavy-handed with that at all. However, just a little reduction in the luminance. You know, currently at -16, I don't know, -10, it's subtle, but it may just help us a little bit with the recovery of that sky detail. So if I toggle that color tool off and then on again, this is before, this is after, we've got rid of a lot of that color contamination. So just to reiterate, this preset we're designing is going to massively improve your photos, but it's not necessarily a perfect end result. Sometimes it can be, it can be a bit of a miracle what it can do for you. But it basically comes down to the quality of the final deliverable you're sending back to your client and what their expectations are, what you're happy to deliver. So if you're a real estate photographer and you want to get your work turned around really quickly, then perhaps this preset with just a couple of adjustments might be all you need to do. But if, like me, you're an architectural photographer, this might just be your starting point for getting your proofs back to your client so they can make a decision as to what they do and don't want to license from you. And from there, you can go on to finesse your work. And I'll put a link to a video at the end where I go into more detail about how you can actually level up your work from what we're creating here. So that's all we need to do for the color section. We don't need to worry about anything in color grading because, again, this is very much an artistic choice as to putting in toning into your shadows and your highlights. That's not something we'd want to do as standard as part of an import preset. So I'm just going to hold the Alt key and click on reset there just to reset those, close that up. But we do want to look at detail. Currently we've got all of Lightroom's default settings here. So the best thing to do when working with details is to zoom in so you can see much better what you're doing. Now, the exact amounts that you put in for sharpening are going to be dependent on the quality of your lens and the size of your sensor. So the numbers that I've found that work quite well for me is having a radius around 1.5, 1.6, boosting up the sharpening amount quite a lot. Again, you don't have to have your sharpening set this high for your final deliverable image. It might be a little too excessive, but I just want to make sure that the client looking at my work can see all of the details if they want to. Now, as I set these a little higher, if we've got noise in our image, which we will start to see because we've boosted those shadows so high at the moment, we're just going to counteract that with a little introduction of noise reduction. So probably around 31, that's normally where I set that. And in terms of the other settings, I just leave them where they are. So let's toggle that off and then toggle it on again, before and after. I'm just going to zoom in a little further so we can really see that. So here's our before. As soon as we turn that on, pop, that looks much better. But as you can see, as I am zoomed in here, there's a little bit of chromatic aberration that we're going to need to deal to. So let's move on and take care of that. As you know, it's really easy to take care of. We just remove chromatic aberration on. So if I zoom into approximately that same area and we turn it off, if you look at the edge of the chair here, and now I turn it on again, that just takes care of that. You'll often see a bit of chromatic aberration around window frames. That's a good place to spot it. So if I turn it on, that pretty much takes care of that. And now I'll just zoom out and we'll look at our whole image again as we do this very important checkbox here, which is enable profile corrections. Here's our before, here's our after. And what you want to do is make sure you're either on default or auto so that Lightroom is assessing the file that it's looking at and knows exactly which lens and which make of lens is on your camera so that it can make the appropriate adjustments. And as you can see, it takes care of that barrel distortion quite nicely. And now we'll close lens correction down, and that is it for our preset. We don't want to deal with transform in the actual preset process, and I'll explain why in a moment. But effects, we certainly don't want to be working with any post-crop vignette or anything like that. Not necessary in this preset. The same for the process version and calibration. We don't even want to touch that. So let's have a quick look at our before and after. I'm going to press the / key so that we can see our before. That is our raw, untouched file, just with the Adobe standard profile applied. And this is our preset version. Here's our before, here's our after. So I'm happy with that preset, and those settings work very well for my D850 and the setup that I have. But I would recommend that you just use this as a base and test those settings and make sure you're happy, because the key for this is not for it just to look good on this photo. You want it to look good on as many photos as possible. You don't want too many outliers where, oh, that preset didn't work for that one. You want it to be consistently good and consistently improving your photos when you apply it. So we're going to save this preset, and then you're going to have access to it to apply it during import to your whole catalog. So you're going to come back from your photo shoot all exhausted but excited to see the work, download it, import it into Lightroom, and during import you're going to apply this preset and everything's going to look fantastic straight out of the box. But there's going to be one more thing, possibly two, that you'll need to do just to really kind of finesse things, but it shouldn't take you more than a couple of seconds for each photo. So after we've saved this preset, I'll show you that next. So to save your preset, you want to come over to the preset section, which you'll find as long as you're in the develop module, not in the grid. So press D on the keyboard, make sure you're in develop, come to the little plus icon here, add new preset, and there we just create preset. Make sure you call it something logical and appropriate for your camera, and then make sure it's being saved in the correct area, because the group that it normally saves in as default is the user presets. So what I would recommend doing is just set up a new group specifically for your architectural photography presets. I'm saving mine in my 2023 section right here. And now this next section is absolutely key. We want to make sure that we've only turned on the things that we want to change, or potentially things that we want to override. And as I'm looking through this list of what I'm going to include or disclude from the preset, I've realized we've overlooked something very important. Well, I have. So kudos to you for carrying on watching the video, because if you've closed it already, those people have missed out. Very, very important. And that is looking at the tone curve, because that is actually a really foundational pillar for this preset. I can't believe that I nearly missed it. So let's quickly dive back into the tone curve and fix that up. So I'll go to cancel, open up the tone curve here, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but we actually have two different types of curve that we can work with. And I'm not talking about the individual color channels versus the luminance channel. I'm talking about two distinct curves that we can actually work with both of them simultaneously. So the first thing I'm going to do is work with our point curve. So as you know, we bring that down, things get darker. We bring it above the 45-degree line, things get brighter. And so the benefit of working with this tone curve is we can actually brighten up the midtones, because through the process of what we've done so far, I usually find it's the midtones that get a little bit dark, a little bit muddy, and they normally need just a little bit of a boost up. So what we can do is just boost those midtones with the point curve. If we don't want to lift the shadows too much, we can put a point there and just sort of bring those down if we want. And as a consequence of lifting up the midtones, you can see the top part of the curve is lifted up as well, which has pretty much blown out the details out of the window that we worked so hard to recover initially. So I'm going to double click that to reset that bit, and you can see, yes, we're losing information out there, or it's getting a little bit too bright. So what I want to do is just put another point up there in the highlights and just control that, bring it down so that we're not brightening that area too far. And I'm just going to work with the midtones and just try and make a more sort of gradual movement on that curve. And we can toggle the box off and on, and I don't think we're affecting outside of the window too much, but we're certainly lifting up those midtones. No, I'm not super happy with the look of that, so I'm just going to go again and just see if I can't refine that. Maybe we don't need to boost the midtones quite as much, quite as aggressively. Okay, I'm happy with that, and now I can switch over to the region version of the curve, which is going to allow us to double down on what curves can do for us. So far we've boosted up the midtones, but now let's actually introduce an S curve. So I'm going to be really extreme with this so you can see what an S does for us. Look at that, a lot more contrast, brought back a lot of those problems that we resolved before. But if we do this subtly, we can have the best of both worlds, which was a boost in the midtones and now an increase in contrast with that S curve. So here's our before, here's our after. Look at that. So we've got a really nice pop to this now that was missing without the addition of those curves. So thank you for staying with me. Now let's go back in to save this preset. Do excuse the croaky voice, I'm not particularly well at the moment. You're lucky you're the other side of that camera. Okay, so we come to the plus icon, create preset, call it something appropriate. Now I'm going to press check none so that we can go through these and just make sure we know what we're saving. So treatment and profile, yes please, because that's the flat profile we applied. White balance, no thanks. Exposure, no thanks. Contrast, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, absolutely. We've also added these things in presence, the texture, clarity and dehaze. We also want to add vibrance. Now, although we didn't change the saturation, I want to bake that into the file just in case the saturation slide has been moved for any reason. It's going to reset that to 0, and that's what we want. I want to make sure I include those tone curves that we just created. The HSL and color section, absolutely. No color grading. However, let's turn that on again because that's going to force it to reset if there is any color grading that's been applied to a file, and we want to go back to the initial import preset. That's just going to reset it. We're going to turn on all of the detail options, all of the lens corrections, and we're going to leave the transform options off because unlike the color grading and the saturation that we want to reset, it's possible that we may have put some transform guides on and actually corrected the geometry. And if we turn this on and save the fact that we've got no transformation applied, it's going to reset any of those geometric transformations we may have deliberately applied. So I'm going to make sure that that is off. Although we didn't apply these, that's going to zero those out, and also the calibration as well. Just by ticking those, they get zeroed out. I'm not too worried about creating adaptive presets for different ISOs because I usually shoot at ISO 100, so that's always a consistent factor. I don't need variations of this preset. So now I'm happy with all of that. I just click create, and there we have it, interior import D850 ready to go. So how are we going to speed up our workflow and apply this automatically during import? Let me show you. I'm going to press G on the keyboard to come to grid, and we're actually just going to delete all of these for now. So I'm just going to remove those photos, remove from Lightroom, don't want to delete them from disk, and I'm just going to re-import them so I can show you what we do. So obviously come to the import, so press on import, navigate to the folder that contains your photos, make sure we're adding the photos in, and in the develop settings, now if we come to the group that contains the preset we just made, interior import D850, we click that, and now it's going to apply that to all of these photos during the import process. So I click import, and now all of our photos that are part of bracketed sets are brought in with those presets applied. So again, if I press D on the keyboard to go to the develop module, and if we were to reset this, we're going to see what the original raw looked like. And I'll just press Ctrl Z to undo that to get us back to the application of that preset. Doesn't that look so much better? Now, as you can see, if I go back to the grid view and press T on my keyboard to get the toolbar up here and increase the thumbnails, and now as I scroll through these, you can see that the preset affects the photos differently depending upon their exposure. So for example, this image here, apart from the converging verticals, this is pretty much good to go back to the client. Whereas if I go one stop brighter, we're still losing the information out of the window. Or if I go darker where we recover outside the window, it's too dark on the interior. So now it's a really easy process of just going through your set of bracketed images and just picking the best one from each set, which you might think, oh, well, that should be my base exposure. That should be the one that looks the best. But it's not always that simple. Sometimes I find the exposure that is +1 EV above that base level is actually the one that looks better. But we don't really need to concern ourselves with that at this point. The important thing is that we have that bracketed set available to us for more refined post-production. But at this initial step, we very quickly got what we need to send back to our client. So I would press G on your keyboard, and what I like to do, if I've been working with sets of 5, I will normally grab my thumbnail slider and put that to a point of view where I can see 5 up at a time. But for this set of photos, it's not actually that straightforward because it's a bit of a mismatch of images from different jobs. So anyway, I'm going to use the paintbrush to actually apply a flag to the photo that I'd like to use. So I'll go for the middle exposure here, this one here, the one that we actually built our preset with, probably that exposure there, probably this image here, base exposure for the bathroom, and probably the base exposure for this shot as well. And now if we filter by the flagged images, and I quickly flick through these, you can see how quickly we've been able to get our photos in a pretty good state with just that one preset. The final step for me is to actually just correct the geometry in the transform section using the guided tool. Now, one thing you could do if you wanted is to actually build auto into your preset, and that can be a huge time saver. So if I come through and I just click auto here, it's worked well for those two. I'll turn it on to this one. It's not too bad. But as I use it on this one, you can see that it's not very accurate and our verticals aren't actually true at all. And so I actually find by using auto, it's more of a hassle than it's worth. And I normally come in anyway and actually draw some very quick guides onto my image to do it manually. And that's the reason that I actually leave that out of the preset itself. But it's entirely up to you. What you can do is actually build it into the preset and just see how you go. But the way I'll normally work is just come through these images very quickly, make sure my verticals are looking good by actually using the guided tool. Occasionally I will also crop the photo just a little tighter if need be. And every now and again things will bug me just a little bit too much, like the darkness in this room here, and I might just throw a very quick radial gradient on where I might just say boost up the exposure. But honestly, couple of clicks and you're done. It's so quick. Another thing might be I may just want to boost the exposure half a stop. But just like that, I've got a set of images that I can send back at the very least for proofing. Like I say, they may be adequate enough if you're sending these back as real estate images. Let me just do a quick create virtual copy, and then on those copies, I'm just going to reset them so that we can flick through the before and after. So in each case, when we consider what we started with as the raw file to where we got to with the application of that simple preset that we've created, I think we're in a much better place. For example, this is the type of shot where a lot of people would argue, oh, you have to do flambient for this, need to introduce a flash, but in fact, no, you don't. And here we've got the image that we actually started working on initially with our before and our after. The contrast differential in this image was insane. So bright out there, so dark inside, but with that preset and a very quick local adjustment, we've got a file that we may be able to send back to our client. Again, a very contrasty image, dark inside, bright outside, and our preset's given us a good foundation of something we can send back to our client. Now, as useful as this quick fix preset is for fixing up our architectural interiors, would I ever send back one of these photos as a finished piece to an architect or interior designer? Absolutely not. There are many techniques that I employ to make sure that we're pushing as close to perfection as we can do with those final images, and therefore demanding a higher fee in return for the value that we provide to our clients. And if you want to see how I actually finesse my images to that next level, I'd recommend checking out that video there. I'll see you over there.